Thank you for the invitation. And as they say, now on to something completely different. What I would like to do here is to give an idea about how the debt brake is viewed by the German population, and therefore get an idea about who is actually in favor of these type of fiscal consolidation measures with a long-term perspective. This is joint work with Florian Neumeier, also from the University of Marburg. Now, as we've already heard this morning, as you are very well aware of, we've seen some rough time in the euro area over the last years. And when you look at this slide here, you can see the change in the debt to GDP ratios in the number of countries. And generally what we find is that these ratios are increasing. Right. And so the issue comes up that there may be a time when this has to stop, and so the focus is on fiscal consolidation. Now, the euro area responded to that challenge by creating the European Fiscal Compact. Right? So the idea is that we have all these member countries which are in principle independent, sovereign. They agreed to implementing some sort of debt brake into their legal frameworks, right? And to some extent, this development has been pushed by Germany, which was already on the road to that type of arrangement before the European debt crisis as such broke out. And in 2009, the German Parliament passed the introduction of the debt brake in Germany, and the German Länder followed en suite. Now, what is the idea? Well, the idea is that we tie the government's hands in terms of discretionary fiscal policy, and so they are obliged to keep the budget deficit below 0.35% of GDP, and this basically implies that the possibility of running increasing government debt has become fairly small indeed. Now, it's important to realize that this kind of rule does not rule out stabilization policy because it's based on the structurally adjusted deficit, and so will take into account the relevant state of the business cycle. Right? So, in other words, during bad times, governments can still run some sort of fiscal expansion, and obviously in good times they will have to do some sort of fiscal consolidation. In terms of some sort of adjustment period, we find that this has been arranged for the federal level, but the German Länder have to implement that until 2020, but there's no explicit type of adjustment period. And it remains to be seen whether all of them are actually able to do that successfully. It will also be interesting to see whether the instrument will work, because you can argue that although it has now been implemented in the Constitution, it is quite unclear what will happen in terms of a violation, right? Well, then there's going to be some sort of constitutional court case, there will be a ruling, and the outcome of the ruling may be that the government violate the Constitution. So it will then have to do something about it, but this process may take quite a bit of time, and it's not obvious what the punishment, in some sense, for a government violating these rules is going to be. Now, when we look at other European countries in terms of the consequences of some of the austerity measures that have been implemented there, we find that there is, to some extent at least, public resistance, right? I've sort of copied a few photos from around Europe, right? We see demonstrations in Athens, in Paris, in Madrid, and some of these became fairly violent, right? So this is an important issue. The welfare of many people are being touched upon, and the question is, how can we implement such, in some way, drastic measures without generating too much adversity in the population? Even in Germany, there was some sort of protest, fairly minor though, and mixed in with the general sort of anti-globalization movement. In terms of protests from interest groups, we found that, for instance, I have a picture here from the Hessischer Landtag, the Hessian Parliament, where groups protested against the introduction of the debt brake in Hessen. So, although there is protest, the situation in Germany is certainly not nearly as charged as that in other countries. Now, there's criticism leveled at the debt brake, both at a conceptual level in terms of the effectiveness. As I've indicated earlier, it's not quite clear whether it's actually going to have a lot of bite, but also in terms of the aims, right? Is it really a sensible idea? Right. And in a sense, a lot will depend on your view of the political system, right? Because at least my view as an economist is this is not a very clever idea, right? We're going to restrict one of the two most important stabilization policies to a large extent. On the other hand, when we factor in what happened in the past, we see that stabilization policy did not really work that well, right? I mean, the spending part always was easy to get by, right? I mean, politicians were willing and eager to expand expenditures in times of need, but they rarely were able to do the opposite during good times, right? So in that sense, we can see that the debt brake as some sort of second best solution where we have to take into account that politicians may not necessarily do what economists prescribe. In general, I think it's fair to say that we know very little about how the population responds to the idea of introducing a debt brake, and we are only aware of one paper that actually looks at this issue in the context of the United States. So what I would like to present here are attempted answers to two research questions, namely, first of all, a basically descriptive question, how is the debt brake viewed by the German population? And second, more analytically, can we find factors systematically explaining differences between individual attitudes towards the debt brake? Okay. Now, why is it interesting to look at Germany? Well, first of all, I'm living here, so it's quite natural to look at that country first. But there are a number of other things that one may want to consider. First, obviously, Germany is one of the biggest supporters of the European Fiscal Compact, right? So it basically pushed the idea of these type of measures throughout Europe. Any type of fiscal decision that is being made in Germany may affect other European countries. Germany, to some extent, is an island of peace in a sea that is rather rough at the moment, right? And it's quite astonishing to see the difference in terms of the crisis as it is perceived in Germany compared to that in many other countries. And in addition, as I indicated earlier, Germany was very early, or relatively early, in terms of implementing first steps towards reining in the ability of politicians to continuously generate public debt. Now, although the typical economist tends to look at different things than public opinion surveys, I think over the last decade and longer, economists have discovered this social science tool as an interesting alternative to standard ways of looking at data, and so there's a fairly large literature using surveys for different reasons. Now, quite often, however, these surveys have been collected by other institutions than the one doing the actual research in terms of economics, right? So quite often we have economists taking surveys from other areas, utilizing their contents for their respective question of interest. And it's, in a sense, certainly not a bad strategy, but sometimes you have the problem that, given the different intentions, the survey design does not really reflect the research question that is asked by economists. So rather than trying to use what is out there, we went back to step one and designed our own survey. And given that we're unable to implement a survey in a convincing way, we opted for contracting the actual collection out to a major German survey institute, the GfK. And so in February 2013, there was a period where 2,000 representative selected people were asked face-to-face by professional interviewers. Now, let me say a bit about the descriptive findings. So first of all, the respondents to the survey are supposed to answer the question of whether they are in favor of the debt brake, whether they are against, or whether this really does not go far enough, right? And as you can see, we also put in an option of no response because for many people this is a highly complex topic, right? And we don't want to collect non-attitudes, right? People just giving any sort of answer because they don't have the opportunity to say, I don't know. So here's the outcome. So when we look at the distribution of answers, we find that the majority of Germans is in favor of the debt brake. So more than 60% say that this is a good idea. For 17%, this does not even go far enough, right? They would have liked to see even stricter measures. And only 8% perceive that as an unwise choice. 14% don't want to answer that question, which we believe to be fairly low. I mean, we would have thought that given the complexity of the issue, more people would have been unable to voice their opinion. Now, let's look a bit closer now at who is actually in favor or against the debt brake. And what we would like to do is we would like to utilize the individual information that we have in our data set to answer various hypotheses in terms of how people's attitudes might be affected. So we just have to go to the political economy literature to derive some hypotheses that we can then test in the context of our data set. Okay, so the first one I would like to talk about is this hypothesis, namely, relatively well-off people are more debt-averse than those who are relatively worse off. So the idea is that if you have money, you may fear that if the government is running large deficits, well, then in the end, they may raise taxes, and of course, you can only tax those who have the money, right? So what type of indicators do we use to measure the type of sort of relatively well-off compared to the not so well-off? Well, first of all, we have an indicator of monthly net household income, which is some sort of indicator for the objective situation, although it is not based on objective data. It's what people state in terms of their household income. Then we have, in addition, a subjective indicator of well-being, where people are supposed to state how satisfied they are with their economic situation. And then, as an indicator of wealth, a very rough one, of course, we ask about house or flat ownership. Right. And I mean, there is a public choice argument that you can find at many places. We just have one source here, where it is being argued that people who are not very well off today are willing to live at the expense of future generations. Now, the second hypothesis relates to differences in terms of the discount rate people have over time. So the idea is that some people have a lot of consumption patience, other people are less patient, and so we would expect to see that those who are more easily able to put off consumption into the future are less debt friendly than those who are very much focused on current consumption. And this, of course, has been discussed in lots of different works in the economics literature. The tax smoothing hypothesis of Barrow is just one example here. So let me tell you a little bit about how we operationalized measuring this propensity towards the future in our survey. So first of all, we tried to measure what we call the typical normal discount rate that we tend to find in our intertemporal economic models. In addition, we have a second type of discount factor that relates to arguments made in the behavioral finance or behavioral economics literature, which emphasizes that people may be over and above the normal discount factor, very short-sighted. And so this myopia is being modeled here by an additional factor that allows us to capture this phenomenon. Now, we can think about these type of discount factors in the context of the typical utility function is given here. So we can see that the discount factor beta, the normal one, would just discount future utility, and then we have the second, the extra myopia discount factor given here in front of the summation sign. So this is pretty standard, and the implementation then works through two experiments, experiments with quotation marks that we include in the survey, namely for calculating the normal discount factor. We asked respondents to choose between a safe payoff of €1,000 to pay it out immediately in comparison to a lagged payout in 6 month time. So we then list a number of values that we should offer those respondents who are willing to wait a little bit, right? And so the higher the amount of money that people choose that they would have to get to feel indifferent between getting €1,000 now and this higher value in the future is then the base for constructing our beta value for the discount rate. In addition to calculate the delta value, we would use the same kind of setup, except that we now shift the whole thing into the future, rather than talking about the period now in comparison to 6 month time. We talk about 6 month time compared to 1 year. Okay, and then again we have a list of values where people can choose what they have to get to feel indifferent between getting €1,000 in 6 month time and how much they would have to get in 12 month time. Okay, and based on that we can then construct beta and delta. Now, the third hypothesis is based on the question of fiscal illusion, right? Again, that's something that appears regularly in public choice literature. So here it is the non-informed voter who falls into a trap, basically not realizing what the politicians are doing, and therefore we would expect that if we increase the information set that is available to voters, this will lead to some sort of awareness and increase averseness to any type of fiscal expansion. Now, what could it be that people would need to know to make these type of decisions more effectively? Well, there's information about the budgetary situation in a country, and of course, in terms of the costs of deficit spending for future generations. Now, we are trying to measure objective knowledge in the population by 3 questions that are relevant to this context. First of all, we asked them whether they know how large the budget deficit of the federal government was in 2012, so in the previous year before we ran the survey. And we give them 4 choices. Then we asked them about the current interest rate on long-term government bonds. And we asked about the inflation rate in this year. Now, don't know whether everybody could answer these questions here, and I'm not going to put you on the spot, but let me tell you what the population answered, right? So the first question regarding the budget deficit was answered by the majority at a value of 3%, although the correct value in boldface was 1%. Right, and you can see that people tend to err on the higher side, so even 5% is believed by a third of the participants in the survey. And 7% is even answered by more than 15%. So clearly, people believed the situation to be much worse in terms of the deficit than it actually was. And I think that reflects the general discussion that we saw in the media at that time. Right. I mean, the debt crisis was all over the place, and so people, without really knowing very much about the actual situation, just saw this hype, and so it was reflected in their intuition in terms of how high the deficit is going to be. In terms of the long-term interest rate on government bonds, we find that less than 40% know the correct answer. Again, people moved to 3 and 5%, indicating that they believe that the costs of incurring government debt are actually higher than they were at the time. In contrast, the inflation rate was relatively well predicted, right? More than 60% know that it was about 2%. On the other hand, it's not quite clear whether this is actual knowledge or just the general reflection that 2% is the magical figure that has been brought into the discussion by the ECB lots of times, and it may just fall back positions. If I don't know how inflation is, I just remember, oh yes, the ECB is sort of dedicated to the 2%, and so this may have been the reason why this turned out to be so much better. In any case, those people who didn't know the correct answer erred again in terms of a higher value, right? They thought inflation was rather 5% than 0%. Okay, so as an additional factor to this objective knowledge, there's the issue of what people believe about their own knowledge, right? You can think about that as subjective knowledge. Right. I may not know a lot in terms of objective knowledge, but I may believe that I'm really very knowledgeable. Right. And you just have to think about your colleagues, and you will find plenty of examples where this seems to hit the mark. And so we try to bring that into the survey as well, to have the objective as well as subjective side of knowledge. Hypothesis 5 looks at the issue of what is it that politicians are doing. And the argument would be that if you have doubts that politicians use the tax money for, and the money that is borrowed through public debt is used for useful purposes, well then you may be less reluctant to cut off that financing through a debt break. Okay. So we have 3 questions trying to find out how people view politicians. The first question has, on the one side, the view that most politicians in Germany act according to general public interest, and in contrast, the other side would be most politicians in Germany only serve the interests of particular groups, right? And so really, we are trying to measure whether people believe that politicians serve the public interest. The second question is whether politicians are concerned about the country's long-term well-being, in contrast with the typically by economists voiced opinion that politicians only look until the next election. So here the issue is on whether people believe that politicians are long-term oriented. And the third question looks at whether the management of revenues by the government is properly done. So on the one hand, we have the issue that the state manages tax revenues conscientiously. On the other hand, we have a wasteful use of resources. And here we're clearly asking about the fiscal competence, right? Is it that the money is used in an efficient way? So here are the answers, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you can see that in general, the Germans have more confidence in politicians than distrust. They also generally believe that politicians serve the general public interest, and they are concerned about the country's well-being. Right. And finally, they also believe that the money that is being collected is being used in a conscientious way. Right. We also ask about an ideology question, which you find at the bottom of this table, namely whether the state should ensure equal living conditions across different German regions, and the opposite would be it should not try to equalize incomes to a large extent. And again, you'll find that the majority thinks that the state should not ensure an equal distribution of resources. Okay, anyway, so hypothesis number 6 looks at the issue of political preferences. Here we have the idea that on the one hand we have supporters of the debt break coming from the right wing. In contrast, those who are rather in favor of left-wing parties may be quite critical of the debt brake. And this is something that we tend to find in the political economy literature, but we also saw, and there was a picture of that early in the presentation, that in Germany, protest against the debt brake was mainly organized by left-wing political actors, such as the leftist party, the Linke, as well as the German trade unions. So we asked respondents about their party preference. Now, we then used the individual dimension of our data set to estimate a multinomial logarithm model, which helps us understand the respective experimental power of each of these factors. And the multinomial logarithm model has the advantage that we don't impose some sort of hierarchical ordering on these answers, but each of the equations is modeled independently in terms of the influence of the respective variables on the respective category. We have a number of controls that I just list here without going through them in detail. Now here is a long table, right? We're going to cut that into several pieces, so we're moving down the table now in terms of slides, and I'm going to ask you to remember all the numbers you're going to see here. No, not really, so all I want to do here is point out where we find significant effects and where not, and then we're going to talk about that a bit more detailed later. So we find that there's some evidence that household income matters. We see that the discount factor has a significant effect here. Knowledge plays a role in terms of the factual knowledge, but not in terms of subjective knowledge. We see that the political trust variables are relevant, and there's some evidence of a party preference. And when we look at the control variables, we don't really see very much. Right. Okay, let me just jump to the interpretation. So first of all, what about our first hypothesis, right? The economic situation, does it play a role? And the answer is, to some extent, yes, right? Because we find that the larger a respondent's household income, the lower the likelihood that she opts for an even stricter balanced budget rule. So in other words, rather than expecting that those who have money to be rather in favor of the debt brake, we find some evidence to the contrary. Right? So in that sense, we would rather reject the first hypothesis. And this may have to do with the interpretation of the income variable in this framework, but I think the discussant is going to say something on that. As it stands, we find that an increase in household income by 1,000 euros is associated with a 4 percentage point increase in the likelihood of expressing that the government should not incur any additional debt at all. Second, time preference. So here we find that the time preference indicator beta has the expected impact. So the greater a person's concerned about the future, the lower the likelihood that she will oppose a balanced budget rule. And when we conduct the experiment by increasing this beta by 1 unit, we find that the probability of opposing the debt brake falls by almost 14 percentage points. But this is a very large change, not very realistic. So the effect itself is not likely going to be that dramatic. So in general, we find some support for that hypothesis.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. The information set variables seem to be relevant in terms of the objective variables. So we find that if you give the correct answer to our knowledge questions, then it's less likely that you disagree with the debt brake, and these effects are fairly large. So we have a 7 and 9 percentage point reduction of probability, reflecting whether you were able to answer 2 or 3 questions correctly. Those who are really very well informed, who know all of the questions, see a 14 percentage point reduction probability, which is a very large effect indeed. Right? So being informed about the situation has a profound impact on how the debt brake is perceived, whereas we find no evidence for this subjective knowledge channel. When we look at trust in politicians, we find that those who believe that politicians are benevolent, they don't really think that the debt brake is as necessary as before, which basically implies that we support this hypothesis. In terms of party preference, we find significant effects, but some of them are puzzling. So on the one hand, we have the FDP, the Liberal Party, which very much is its supporters are very much favoring the debt brake. On the other hand, we also find this result for the left-wing voters, right? Which, as I said, is quite puzzling. We may be able to explain that to some extent, but I'm not going to spend any time on it, given that I'm almost out of it. So we also find that there is a strong effect from those voters not captured by our party choice, right? And so the question is, why is it the case that some of the voters who don't adhere to any of the established political parties are very much in favor of the debt brake? Well, that might exactly be the group of people who vote for the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. Right, which has not been a force at that point in time. Right. So in general, we find that party preference matters, but in terms of the interpretation, there still needs to be some work to be done, I guess. So let me conclude. So using a representative survey on the German population, we investigated attitudes towards debt brake. We find that in general, a vast majority supports that instrument. And we find that to some extent we're able to support economic hypotheses about who's going to be very much in favor of the debt brake. So we see that time preference matters, factual knowledge matters, as well as trust in politicians' motive. And we were not able to find consistent results in terms of the economic situation of respondents as well as their party preference. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.